Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Jussi Jylkkä. Jussi is a philosopher and psychologist based at Åbo Akademi University in Finland. In 2008, he completed a PhD in philosophy at the University of Turku on the relationship between language and reality. He then began studying the hard problem of consciousness and had a transformative mystical experience. After becoming frustrated that he couldn't express this insight in words, he moved to study psychology, and in 2017 completed a second PhD, this time in psychology. His research interests include consciousness, psychedelics, Zen philosophy, metaphysics and epistemology, all of which we talk about today. Hope you enjoyed the conversation. Okay, I am here with Jussi Jylkkä. Jussi, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I think there's quite a lot of things that we share interests in. So maybe a good place to start would be with kind of mystical experience, because I personally had a kind of spontaneous mystical experience at a young age. And I understand you had a similar kind of spontaneous mystical experience.
Yes, I had. Although the term mystical experience is so artificial, but I have found that it's the most proper way to refer to it, although it's a bit corny, but it captures something essential about the experience, the ineffability and I don't know if it's life transforming for me, but it's like worldview changing experience.
So what happened for you? I mean, I know it's by definition it's hard to put into words, but
yeah, it was about 11 years ago. I was working from home, like at distance. It was a clear winter day. I was doing philosophy research back then, and actually I was working on philosophy of mind and the hard problem of consciousness. And I had just defended my PhD in philosophy on theories of reference, and then I thought, now I will focus on philosophy of mind, which is my passion. And there I was thinking about the epistemic gap, and it somehow struck me that consciousness is concrete and fundamental, and everything else we know merely through representing it or observing or modeling, or somehow it's external to us and we only have this kind of immediate knowledge of it. And consciousness is this here is what is the most real thing that exists. And it's really hard to put into words, but I also saw how everything is continuous with consciousness. And this is actually, I come from a materialist background, and I consider myself as a materialist or physicalist and a naturalist. So I think that consciousness is literally a neuronal process or some kind of physical process, probably in the brain. At least the brain is a necessary condition for consciousness. Then there are these extended cognition theories and active inference theories that partly situate consciousness outside the brain. But anyways, it's physical. But if consciousness is physical, if this is physical, does it tell more about consciousness or about matter? Because of this epistemic gap, because we cannot even infer the existence of consciousness by reading science alone, and it's logically possible that you wouldn't have consciousness, although I think it's a bit unethical or like problematic to say this, doubt your thoughts and feelings, their existence. But it's logically possible, as demonstrated by solipsism. So there is this gap between science and consciousness. There is this some kind of dualism. And where does this dualism come from? So I felt that it's the dualism between representation and the represented, or my sensations and the sensed. Like here, you are there in London, and I know if we forget about solipsism and all these stupid logical possibilities. I know that you are conscious. I know that your expressions and your words, they are produced by your thoughts and your mind. So you are the underlying cause of my perceptions, the hidden cause of my perceptions. That's something out there that moves the pointer readings, like Arthur Eddington says. So that's somehow, it's fundamental. Consciousness is fundamental, and it was really moving experience. It was an emotional experience. I became a vegetarian after that, and I felt this like deep sympathy towards everything that exists, like living beings.
Right. I think the feeling of, you described consciousness as concrete, as I guess, as opposed to abstract, right? It's not like a model. It's this real thing that genuinely exists. And I think I definitely have had the same experience of, but I mean, we'll get into, for me, I think of consciousness as emergent and as just existing in systems like myself, but perhaps not in atoms. But despite that, I still share this intuition of concreteness, where I would say, even though there are parts of the universe that are not conscious in my worldview, where there is consciousness, it's just as real as anything else, as the stuff studied by physics. And I understand the intuition of saying it's actually more real in the sense that those are just models that we have of the physical world, whereas this is it. I mean, I know you've read around kind of Zen Buddhism, and I think Alan Watts has a book called You're It, and it's this kind of, it's hard to say what it is, but it's the thing that reality is, and this experience is it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You also mentioned kind of this idea of thisness in Zen as well, as something I know you've spoken about on your YouTube channel. Do you find that's a useful way of referring to this concreteness?
I think that's a good way to capture the epistemics, because when I say that consciousness is the most concrete thing, it only applies to myself. Like it's an epistemic point. Well, it's also a metaphysical point, but I like to emphasize this epistemics because I don't really like metaphysics, because it easily goes to this abstract play with words. But on the epistemic side, it's demonstrated by these Cartesian thought experiments, or by Plato's cave. I think it's this kind of insight or intuition that is shared by most cultures. The idea that what we perceive is somehow only the surface, that there is some underlying concrete reality beyond that surface. And now, quite concretely, we have these computer screens here between us as the surfaces. But is it somehow possible to transcend that surface and really connect with another person? That's an interesting question in its own right. But anyway, this like concreteness for me myself, this is the only physical process that I am, and everything else is distinct from me or outside my Markov blanket, or how would you theorize it? I don't know. And you said that it's as concrete as anything other that is physical, like lightnings and atoms and photosynthesis and so on. But I know this process differently than I know photosynthesis. But it's of the same general kind that is physical.
Right. And so, I mean, I think it's a nice way of thinking about this, the gap being between the real thing, which is this experience, and then the model of it, right? So I've heard you say that science is a picture of reality, and it's this idea that the map is not the territory. And I think this is a mistake that a lot of people in science fall into, right? If they've not had a kind of mystical experience where they realize how or they realize that reality itself can't really be put into words. Like this, the essence of being, can't be. It's not the same thing as a model, and everything we say about it is a model. So I think you and I share this feeling that that's really important, that we're very clear that all of science, everything science says, is models. It's not really the thing in itself.
Yeah. You put it really nicely. Somehow the difference between the model and the modeled, and many people, when I talk with them, they say it's just trivial. Of course, the word is not the object, or the model is not the modeled. What are you talking about? And they don't somehow share this enthusiasm about this idea. So it's somehow different to personally experience it and feel it in your guts than to just abstractly understand that the word is not the object. At least I myself have this sense of mystery, which is a bit almost irrational sense of mystery at the face of existence, my own existence and everything else. I know it's all of the same kind of matter, same kinds of physical processes. Essentially, everything is made of atoms, and it all comes from the same energy from the Big Bang. It just takes different forms, this energy. Nothing is added, nothing is taken out. The first law of thermodynamics. But this mystery of how ineffable this my own existence is, I cannot put it into words, and how little I know about everything beyond this existence, my own existence. And it's like it's good entertainment just to sit and meditate on this, on the wonderment of what is this. It's actually a Korean Zen koan, this what is this question, which lacks an answer.
Yeah, I think the people who don't share our enthusiasm for the kind of understanding the difference between the model and the thing in itself, to me, I think that might be, again, I mentioned, because of a lack of experience of these mystical experiences for those people. But it feels to me like the reason a word like spirituality is necessary, and we can't just talk about things kind of purely rationally, is because there seems to be a spectrum where, in terms of how in our cognition, where on one extreme is living in abstractions, living in thought, rumination, models. And to me, in the extreme, that leads to depression. That's a state of disconnection and stressful kind of overthinking. And then the more you stop doing that and you move into a state of being present, just kind of, in meditation or in a psychedelic state. But if you're truly present and truly quiet and you get rid of the abstractions, the feeling tone is one of, as you say, it feels like existence is a miracle. It feels exhilarating and kind of awe-inspiring. And the scientist in me kind of struggles to say why that is, because this is why a word like spirituality is useful, I think, because it conjures up that there really is something there that's worth exploring experientially. That we can't build a model that kind of trivially dismisses, oh, that's just because your serotonin and your dopamine are going off, or anything like that. There's this experiential profundity to just existing, and I think for me that's why it's significant to me to know when I'm inhabiting models and when I'm really engaging with the real thing. And I've heard of you talk about a kind of, both in science and spirituality, a kind of fundamentalism that you can understand as an obsession with the models, whether that's taking the models in science too literally and thinking the world is genuinely made of atoms, or taking the literal texts of a scripture too seriously, right? Is that how you think about fundamentalism in that way?
Yeah, exactly. It's the same thing in science and religion or any other kind of ism. Science, of course, it's not an ism, it's a methodology, but it consists of theories and observations. And somehow science is more difficult to consider fundamentalistically, because it is changing all the time. It's self-correcting, but maybe that's also one reason why it feels so rational to consider it as fundamental. So it's less irrational than to consider scriptures in the Bible or other holy texts as somehow fundamental or like absolutely true. But there is this similarity, like you said, of mistaking the map for the territory, so to speak. Although nobody admits of doing that. I would say that I was going to say that my everyday existence is typically mistaking the map for the territory, because when I'm like cycling with my bicycle and avoiding the obstacles and so on, so of course I take this, if you would call it, like generative model for reality, but something is mistaken there already, because it's just our existence that is happening when I exist in the everyday life. Somehow it's impossible to mistake the map for the territory in everyday life when we just non-reflectively, we just exist a bit like other animals. But then when we start to conceptualize things and reflect, what is this reality? What is it all about? What is the purpose of it all? Or does it have any kind of purpose? So that's where we somehow face our own ignorance, and we become like afraid. When I cycle there and I just exist and not thinking about it at all, I'm just happy. And but then thinking about these worldview things, it easily gets a bit scary. I have had these discussions that have become quite emotional at times about worldview with a person who is deeply believes that science tells the ultimate truth about reality. And when I question him about this, like questioning, like, don't you see that the map is not the territory? What is the thing in itself that that science models? Well, these are dull questions. Of course, it might try to formulate them better, but he becomes agitated and often angry. So there is something. Of course, these are sensitive issues. Worldview, like if you would go to a religious person and question their worldview, they also become agitated, and maybe I also become agitated about some things. But we are usually blind ourselves to what is really threatening the ground of our being, our beliefs about fundamental reality. And you know this when you get to the core, when you start to become emotional. So it's sort of maybe not any hyper priors, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting, because to me, I feel like to be a living system in a world where there really is no ground, as I see it, reality is just this unfolding process. There is no objective up and down or anywhere to really find solid ground. And we're a process, but we're a process that doesn't want to slip, behave in such a way as to not slip into melding in with everything else in reality. And it does that by building up models, and those models can be very simple of that's food, that's not food. And eventually there could be models like there's a God or there's not a God, or all the stuff we're talking about, right? And so in that picture, your very existence is, you're kind of balanced on a knife edge, so it's stressful. There's kind of existential stress right at the beginning because there is no objective ground. So it makes sense to me that as soon as you start questioning, like, these models are how people are surfing this knife edge of, not to mix my metaphors, but it's how they're managing to get by with this existential stress. And And so unless, to me, I think people who have really developed a kind of experiential familiarity with groundlessness, people who feel they can sit with the unknown, with non-conceptual experience and are okay with that, those are the people I feel see reality clearest. And they're actually the people who could probably say the least about it, because they would recognize that everything you say is a model, is an approximation. And here we are talking for over an hour probably about with all of our models. So you can read into that what you will. But yeah, so I shared that intuition that people are very, it's inherently emotional because you're tapping into this existential stress when you talk about these issues.
Yeah, existential. It's interesting because it doesn't objectively threaten our existence. It only threatens our worldview. But our worldview, of course, is our existence. The way we experience the world, it is our subjective existence. Somehow I feel that I now like put people against each other because we are all prisons of our systems or our own mind. Sometimes I feel like it's a locked in state where it oscillates between this solipsistic idea that this, my own existence, is the only thing I really know, and that you might be a hallucination, and it's really this psychotic kind of questioning everything. And then on the other side, you can start thinking, here we are interacting. I hear your speech. I hear your thoughts. I can hear your mind, so to speak. And then I feel like this connection that we are part of the same process. Or when I walk in the forest, I can feel that I'm the same as the forest. And both of these are possible. And it's really weird. How is it possible that everything is one and everything is two at the same time? So it's really weird what is happening there.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I mean, to me, the thing that moves you on that spectrum is how grounded versus kind of anxious you feel. So I think you're right that solipsism can be a kind of psychotic state, because I think most people find it unsettling. It's kind of to think you could be the only mind in existence in a way where you're still holding on to your sense of self. That's the most kind of isolating feeling imaginable. To imagine, as you say, you're locked in and this is it, and you're never going to know anything else. But if you are truly non-attached and you just observe those things, I think you tend to collapse into the opposite of kind of, I mean, I think it's because the more non-attached you get, you lose your sense of self, and then everything just is everything, and you're it all, but not the small you who's the ego who lives in the head, who's anxious, but this big mystical experience of being everything. I'm a big advocate for always bringing this back to how experientially grounded do you feel? Because I think in philosophy, my experience is a lot of people turn to these questions because they have some sense of existential anxiety. I don't get this impression with you, but with a lot of people, that's the impression I get, that there's a desperate need to find a story that's reassuring. So if you're lost in the woods and some traumatic thing happens and you find a map, you might have this really intense desire to believe this map is the one you need that will get you out of the woods. And if someone comes along and goes, hey, I think your map is wrong, or you know what, you can't really trust any maps, you're just gonna be like, shut the hell up, I need to get out of here. I need this emotionally. Do you have the impression that people in philosophy sometimes are people who have this need for a good story, a reassuring story about the world? Or maybe even the opposite, maybe people who are really open to being radically skeptical?
Good question. You put it really nicely, this guy lost in the forest with the map. I don't know, because I only know from my own background how I became frustrated in philosophy. I have my own reasons for being sometimes quite um, negative attitude towards philosophy, because it is this kind of conceptual play that doesn't get anywhere. It is just circulating the real thing without realizing that there is a real thing. And often it feels like we as philosophers, we should just be quiet. But then again, these are so important things that we, at least I feel the pressure to talk about them. And it's so nice to find other people who think in the same way, or to make someone realize how they are constantly facing this ultimate mystery of existence. Every second of their life we are facing this. Life is never boring when you realize that, and philosophy can get you there sometimes. Psychedelics can get you there, meditation, many kinds of practices can get you there to realize this. Maybe it's also Socrates' basic point, how little we know. But sometimes philosophy, I became frustrated because it never seemed to capture this idea, but maybe I was doing just wrong kind of philosophy. Well, Kantian philosophy, this is basically the main point of Kant, that we don't know things in themselves, but somehow that also easily leads to this scholastic system building. And the bigger systems you build, the more you have to lose. When your system just crumbles down in the face of brute existence, Zen philosophy is maybe the best or most honest kind of philosophy, where they basically admit that everything they do is completely insane, because they shouldn't be talking at all. Alan Watts should not have written any books, because it just gets us further from the thing in itself. But somehow it can also act as this kind of Wittgenstein's ladders that get you there, and then you throw them away. But you never find those people who really throw away the ladders, who just stop speaking.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the when you said that philosophy is kind of circling the thing in itself, that made me realize that I think I've had the same insight that you were describing around the model and the territory when it comes to philosophy. I feel like I've had the same insight multiple times in psychedelic experiences, where I'll find that there'll be a moment where I'm very much in my head thinking about something, and say I'm thinking about consciousness or whatever it is. And at some point I'll realize that I'm engaged in what feels like a really neurotic thing of like a dog chasing its tail, and it's never going to catch it, because no matter what I say, no matter what combination of words I say in my head, it's never going to bite the tail of the snake and and swallow it up. But I think this is I get the impression actually a lot of people who want a scientific theory of consciousness, I think they somehow expect a successful theory to swallow up the territory. And it's hard to put into words, but I get this impression that what they really want, when they think they've found the theory, somehow the lights will go out, somehow experience will stop. It sounds very odd to say, but what I mean is it's because I think they're not recognizing that feeling of the kind of miraculous, awe-inspiring thing of like, we genuinely exist. This is really happening. And if you're expecting a scientific theory to make you go, okay, existence and my experience of it is just that, it's just X, Y, Z. Now yes. I don't have to feel awe. That's never going to happen. And I think it's that unconscious neurotic chasing the thing in itself, and it's never going to encompass it.
Yes, exactly. Sometimes I feel that when you look at psychedelic paintings, you often have these recursive patterns, whether they could reflect some kind of internal process of this recurrent snake chasing its tail. Because it's not only about scientific or philosophical theories, it's also about introspection. about this here, because when I start to conceptualizing this experience here, it's already gone. And now there is another experience. It's a constant flow with no static points. I cannot take an experience here and start to investigate it and conceptualize it, because the moment I make any conceptual processes, the experience or my state of consciousness has changed. And this is one thing that is really difficult to express, put into words. It's like to start with the easy point, or the easy way of formulating the point is to speak of non-reflective consciousness, as in meditation or the psychedelic state, or like these altered states of consciousness where you are non-reflectively present. Your default network is like less active, and you are less reflective, less conceptual. So it's easy to see this, like the brute consciousness in that kind of state. But when you start to think of that, at least I have come to the conclusion that everything is that same brute consciousness. Even this conceptual process here, what I'm doing now, if I'm expressing my own feeling right now that I'm a bit afraid, or I feel this like anxiousness about expressing this difficult issue. So now my consciousness is already different when I do this kind of conceptual process. And my speaking here is also this. It is also this brute unfolding process of consciousness, like this. From the external perspective, they are all just causal processes that just happen, and there is no reflection ever happening. Everything is always brute and primordial. And one way to put it more rationally, or to like intellectually understand it, might be to like focus on that. Well, I won't go into that. It would be the topic of an academic paper. Do you understand this idea?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to pick up on the what you said at the start of the idea of in psychedelic paintings, like a snake that's kind of repeatedly chasing its tail, because you described another experience in the same area that I've had. That, yeah, you described exactly the same experience, and I have this drawing that I'll show you, which is it was kind of me traveling through time in this kind of corkscrew shape. So it's like the circling around of the snake trying to bite its tail, but it's going through time. So it's three-dimensional. And the idea was that, exactly as you said, that you have an instance of experience and then the model forms. And by the time the model's formed, it's never going to catch the experience because it's already happened. And I could just feel that this is our predicament. You know, when we want to model our experience of being, we're always in this corkscrew where it's never going to meet up. And so actually, I'd love to dive into your worldview. Kind of, we can, yeah, I mean, we've been talking about it tangentially, but I'd love to kind of build it up from scratch. And so you've described it as naturalistic monism. And I think I also share the view of you know, being someone who is aligns with naturalism. Do you have a kind of definition of naturalism? Because I find it personally quite hard to define. But how do you think about what it means for something to be naturalistic?
Usually, it's considered to consist of two aspects, at least on David Papineau's thinking, that there is this metaphysical or ontological component, that everything is physical or material, and the methodological component, we should somehow stick to the methodology of science when we want to say something about reality. So that would be naturalism, and I have been struggling with that term as well, but in the context of consciousness, for me means that there are no properties or aspects of consciousness that are beyond the scope of science. Science can literally model consciousness just like it models this cup, but the model is not modeled. So the point is not like Russellian monism, for example, or Philip Goff says that there are these intrinsic properties, one class of properties, intrinsic properties that consist our like what it's like to be us. Consciousness is intrinsic property, and then there is this other class of properties, extrinsic properties that science investigates, relational properties like mass, acceleration, and firing rate of neurons, and so on. And it's kind of dualism. David Chalmers, well, this like author. What is it called? This argument from authority, but he says it explicitly that it's like property dualism, but it is because there are two kinds of properties, extrinsic and intrinsic. So I want to avoid that kind of dualism. So this brings us to monism part, that you only have these properties that science models. There is only one class of properties, and they are all of the same one general kind as our consciousness, or you can also say that they are physical. And science models all these processes, and some of these processes are conscious in this sense that we are conscious, or other mammals. So that's the naturalistic monism, which is really not, it's not a theory of consciousness. It's a theory of how scientific models are related to reality. That there is this kind of, you still have the dualism. You never get rid of dualism as long as you are a living organism with a Markov blanket, because you have the outside and you have the inside. So I think the dualism that led Descartes to substance dualism, and that led Russellians to property dualism, it is in reality dualism between me and you, between me and everything that is not me, because everything that is not me appears to be physical, like spatial, and everything that is this appears like this. And many people say it's like consciousness, but you can use any terms that you find suitable.
Yeah, I would agree with that distinction. And when it comes to naturalism, I think, for me, I mean, if you think about the supernatural, to me, that it relates to monism in the sense that if there was a supernatural thing, then it wouldn't fit in with the rest of our description of the world. If there's a God that's outside the laws of physics, then there's a split there. But if the world is just made of one thing, so to me, naturalism is kind of inherently monistic. And as you say, it's kind of, I would say maybe it's intelligible in the sense that it can be broadly made sense of using science. We can measure it and make sense of it. Because I think when we say something, I think you said, in the naturalistic view, everything's made of matter or the stuff of physics. And if you're someone who mistakes the map for the territory, then you could say, oh, you think everything's made of atoms or whatever it is. But I think we probably both share a sense of the stuff that we call matter, the stuff that we call physical is, I mean, I would say it's the thing in itself in the sense that it's completely unknowable. But it's not some mundane hard stuff that's just like little bricks that make everything up. It's the stuff of reality. And I think maybe in your worldview you might say it's consciousness. You have it's interesting that you describe yourself as a kind of physicalist or materialist, because I think your position, it seems very similar to Bernardo Kastrup and his position on, he called himself an idealist, where the thing in itself in reality is consciousness. So consciousness is the fundamental thing that reality is made of, and then everything else is description.
Yeah, I should read more of his work. I was recently reading his synopsis on his treatment of Schopenhauer, and I think it strongly resembles how I think. but still consciousness is just a word. And to say that we somehow really know something about what things in themselves beyond our consciousness are is it is problematic. I can say that it is continuous with my consciousness based on the scientific worldview. Like you said, everything is made of atoms. But to say that it is continuous, it is a really weak claim. It is the same kind of claim that reductive materialism says, that you can dissolve this, like break into parts consciousness, and you have these really simple kinds of atoms, and taking any kind of matter you can make up a conscious mind. So it's a reductive materialist view that like it's all just physical processes. But what is physical? This is physical, this here. But I only know this little slice of the physical, and it's a really complex physical process, probably. Even the simple meditative state is probably a really complex, neuronally speaking. I can say that everything is continuous with this, assuming monism, or the scientific worldview, which is monistic. But to say that everything would be consciousness, it's problematic. I'm happy to consider myself as a panpsychist or even an idealist. But then again, they are just words. Reality in itself is always ineffable. But I don't really know. This is really difficult, because at times I have this irrational, mystical kind of experience that I just feel reality. That this is reality and everything is same as this. And it's like really strong emotionally and intuitively, but I wouldn't say that it rationally shows what reality is made of. And maybe it's not even consciousness wouldn't be the suitable term, because it's so like anthropocentric. It means our kind of consciousness, and probably that of pigs and cows and cats and so on, other mammals. But what about reptiles and mosquitoes and so on? That is already something far away from our kind of consciousness. And when you go to organic molecules and bacteria and down to atoms and so on, then you have something still more different. So to say that it's consciousness is the term applicable there?
Yeah, I mean, I was really glad to hear you say that the stuff that reality is made of itself is always ineffable. It can never be named. And to me, that's a hugely important point. I share your kind of disinterested metaphysics, in the sense that, to me, the idea of, so I think talking about substances, talking about things being made of other things, if I say my blanket is made of wool, that's a very particular, like, we live in a particular scale where it makes sense to say that some things are made of other things. They stand in that relationship to each other. But to me, that's a very kind of, as a mammal, that's a useful cognitive module we've evolved. But why should that extend to our understanding of reality? To me, I don't think reality, we even need to talk about reality being made of a substance. I just think our way of thinking is quite parochial, and we shouldn't presume we can even make those kinds of claims. I also think if you're a monist and you say everything is made of X, whatever X is, it's kind of meaningless, because language is always relational, right? So I think we share that perspective as well. And so whatever this stuff is that reality is made of, so I thought a place we might differ is that, to me, I feel very strongly that even though I know what it feels like to be this thing in itself, to be a kind of a human organism, I don't want to generalize that to something like atoms or subatomic particles. And it sounds like you were agreeing, because I thought as a panpsychist, you'd think, well, everything has this kind of experience, but it sounds like that's not your position.
It's really difficult because my kind of monism consists of two kinds of mystical aspects. You have the negative mystical aspect that we don't know what matter is in itself, and this comes from Galen Strawson. Like he puts it really, really nicely, elegantly. And then there is the positive mystical aspect of saying that everything is mental or consciousness, or where you infer from your own case to other things. And I think we somehow, well, I personally, I feel that everything is continuous with consciousness, and I somehow feel like I know what reality is made of. And this sounds, when I say it, it sounds ridiculous. How could I? I cannot possibly, but still, it's this kind of emotion that you might say that it's religious, and I'm happy with that term. It's kind of dogmatic, but it's not at all dogmatic actually, because I don't believe it just because someone says or anything like that. It's how I experience existence. I experience that everything is this one single totality, and sometimes I entertain these ways how I could formulate this conceptually. Like it would then be this perennial philosophy, like William James's transmissive theory of consciousness, this prism metaphor that matter in itself is like white light, and when it takes the forms of our brains and bodies, it is reduced to this kind of consciousness. Or there are other kinds of ways to formulate this one idea, which is really like not rational, is to it's just a feeling. When I meditate and I'm somehow in this kind of empty state of pure existence, pure being, that I feel like this is what everything is ultimately like made of. And this is the raw material, or like Aristotelian hylos, that takes different forms. And just a side note, but Peter Sjöstedt had a great lecture on philosophy of psychedelics conference, where he was talking about Spinoza's amor dei intellectualis, like this intellectual love of God. And he was talking about this 5-MeO DMT experience, where you lose sense of time and space, and it's he said that it's not really even, you cannot even call it experience. And I think it might be, I don't know what kind of state that is, but somehow in Spinoza's philosophy, it might, this kind of intuitive state might give us insight of what reality is in itself beyond this my own limited existence. But these are like religious or irrational ideas. I like them, and they are meaningful to myself. They are important to my worldview, but I cannot philosophically justify it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think it's important to split, as you said, the claims that are negative in the sense of negation versus the claims that are positive in terms of asserting things are a certain way. So for me, I'm very hesitant around the positive claims of saying I know what reality is made of, or especially a statement like reality is made of consciousness. That's when I'm very much, I feel like, well, now you're coming up with a model, and a model by inherently isn't true. So But so a phrase that is useful for me is gnosis through negation, in the sense that, I feel like I'm navigating the world with this kind of simulation of a world around me. It's kind of I use it to interact with the thing in itself, to interact with the world out there. And it's highly structured. And we normally have this kind of naive realism where we think my perception of the lamp on the table is the lamp on the table. I see through my consciousness. I think this is really what the world looks like. And then in a mystical experience, you can have all that structure. You can see through all those conceptual divisions, and you realize, okay, it's not how I thought. And it's not that you could still just be seeing a simulation, or whatever analogy you want to use. In Plato's cave, you're still just looking at the shadows. But there are certain attributes, like if you notice that the concepts aren't real, that does reflect something about the reality beyond that you're never going to know directly. But because your consciousness it relates to it in some way, you can get insight into its nature. You could say it's a process, it's ungrounded, it's not made of solid categorical static objects. So to me, that's a way where I feel comfortable saying through subjective experience, you can gain insight, but only by tearing down the kind of models that you held onto too strongly, right? Mm-hmm. I feel like maybe that sounds like maybe you the philosopher in you agrees with that you can't really justify the positive ones in the same way as the negative ones.
Yeah, you cannot, and that's why it is so important to keep those two apart. If you consider panpsychism today, which is at least I haven't seen any real this Schopenhauer's or Kastrop's kind of panpsychism is actually different. I don't know how he would formulate the details, but Russellian panpsychism that Philip Goff, for example, represents, it is a metaphysical system. It is a model, and it is really problematic to say that a model ever captures something about things in themselves. What is shared by this Russellian and Schopenhauerian panpsychism is that they are both Kantian. They rest on the premise that we don't know what reality is in itself. And Kant would not have taken the panpsychist route. He denies that we could say anything positive about things in themselves, and the Russellians violate this Kantian basic doctrine of not saying anything of things in themselves. They say that it's all consciousness. And this Schopenhauer, he relied strongly on this Hindu philosophy and Indian philosophy, and I think it's more subtle in that respect, but it's all problematic because it is ineffable. And my own experience that I have, I want to be honest about it, that it's personal. It's not a philosophical theory, really. It's only how I feel. But still, it's not just how I feel. It is also how I think reality is in itself. And this is the paradox of any kind of religion, or filling this gap with something positive, the positive part of mysticism. The paradox is that you shouldn't really fill in the gap. You should just be silent in the face of the mystery, but then you just feel so strongly that this is how it is. You get the insight or the intuition. So you somehow get this magical kind of knowledge, or you feel like it, and you have no way to communicate it or even systematize it. And even if you try, you have to admit that it's all just words. And then you get to this point where you just should be silent and drum with your friends.
Yeah. And so to go back to this question of how much we can kind of extend, if I know I'm conscious, I assume you are, and then we're going to kind of go from there and say, well, how many things in themselves, have this experience? To me, precisely the thing you mentioned before about living systems having a boundary that allows them to be a subject that, is differentiated from the world around. To me, that's the cutoff point. And I think you can come up with a kind of principled stance that is biopsychist, in the sense that every life form, every bounded living system, even individual cells in my body, we can think of those as centers of subjectivity or consciousness. But when it comes to things out there like atoms and, especially collections of atoms, I feel like you can't really describe boundaries in the same way as you can for living systems. So I find it, if you were to say, is a chair conscious, I actually feel like the line that delineates a chair is in our head, really. It's not out there in the world. Like Theseus's ship, if you change all the planks, the ship is the concept. So you can't really ask, is a ship conscious, because it doesn't exist out there. But living systems do really exist from their own side. They have a certain kind of statistical boundary they maintain. What are your thoughts on that perhaps all life is conscious and that's where it ends?
Yeah, that's excellent point. I was just skimming through your mirror paper today, and I agree that you can make the case that every cell is conscious, like you argue, that consciousness is somehow linked with life, like minimizing free energy, or however you formulate it. But then again, even the free energy principle is just a model. But okay, we have gone through this already, but the chair is an artifact, so it doesn't have a genuine border, and so does same applies to the rock. But then when you take an atom or a molecule, it is self-sustaining. It's not alive in the biological sense, but molecules eventually they are torn apart. They have a life cycle, or like they are born and they die. Even atoms, as far as I know, according to current physics, at some point they will vanish, or like reduce to lower components. And it's difficult to formulate, but for me, the main motivation for these panpsychist ideas is the epistemic gap. That you have the discrepancy between consciousness as it is here, as some kind of neural process, science would model it, but you cannot infer from the scientific model that I am here conscious. From the outside, you can put me into an fMRI device or open my skull, and all you see is flesh and blood. And it's really like, if you look at autopsy videos, for example, you see that it's you just have this amazement of, well, it's a dead body. Well, if you look surgical videos where you see, like, you can have the skull opened and you with electrodes you stimulate certain areas and the subject reacts. It's somehow so vividly manifest the epistemic gap. How is it possible that the thoughts and sensations are somehow in that flesh and blood there? And of course, it's just this naked eye picture. But even if you have the more sophisticated scientific picture, it's still, the gap exists. I can be here conscious, experiencing my life, living my life without knowing that I even have a brain. And I can study your brain and never know what you are thinking. Where there are certain techniques, but I can never like really feel what it's like to be you without becoming you. So there is this kind of border. And somehow it's a deep gap between the model and the modeled. Like take the feeling of pain, intense pain, and some kind of neural process. They are something completely different. And Descartes, he was not dumb, like dualists are nowadays considered as like almost like idiots. but Descartes was a dualist, and it's so deep, this gap, that it can lead to substance dualism. It's not trivial, and to deny this, I think, would be to deny the facts. And if the gap is in our case so deep, it must be really deep also in the case of everything else, because we are not exceptional here. So it leads us to the question again of what is an atom in itself, and to this William James's idea that they are soul dust, the ingredients where consciousness is born. And you have this continuum from the Big Bang and creation of the first generation stars, and then heavier elements and us, roughly. Then there is no divide. All the divisions are made by us scientists. We divide different forms of energy. We divide life and not life. But it's all just our models. And in reality, well, this, again, I just feel it's all one.
Yeah. And I mean, to me, the problem with the epistemic gap, I would say, is, you mentioned with Descartes, the feeling of pain and the physical damage, how, and the kind of the nervous system signaling that. How do you bridge these two different descriptions of the same thing? To me, I feel like with emergent phenomena, we're asking, like, there are genuinely emergent phenomena, and I think with consciousness we refuse to accept that it could be truly emergent, in the sense that the wetness of water, individual molecules of water are not wet. It's a genuine thing that emerges. And I would say the main reason I'm not a panpsychist is when people argue for panpsychism, I very often see this claim that something can't have properties that aren't there at the smaller scale. But to me, that's nonsense. Like a living system is alive, even though its atoms are not alive. If you think of an ecology of animals, an ecology is a real thing. But then if you say, well, take one gorilla, where's the ecology inside that gorilla of that one individual? Well, that you don't need to. If you take a network and you look at an individual node and say, where's the network in that node? The network is a genuinely emergent phenomenon. So to me, I think of consciousness as a kind of interdependent framework, in the sense that pain is painful in reference to not pain, rather than in reference to the physical stuff out there in the world. And there's the structure of consciousness overlays with the kind of patterns in reality, but they are two different phenomena. And so you actually don't need to kind of make the link, between the wavelength of light and the perception of red. The perception of red needs to be cashed out against all the other perceptions. So to me, I feel like you can have consciousness be truly emergent, if it is interdependent in that way, and kind of the quality is cashed out against all the other qualities. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, totally. Consciousness is emergent in this innocent, weak sense, like wetness is emergent from hydrogen and oxygen playing their dance together. I totally agree. And that's exactly the reason why I think that everything is continuous with consciousness, and why I am a panpsychist in that sense. If you consider hydrogen and oxygen, hydrogen is an explosive substance, and it's gas in this temperature, and oxygen is what we breathe, and water is where we drown, and we drink it, and it keeps us alive. It's life supporting, unlike oxygen and hydrogen alone. So there is this emergence, which I agree with you. It is completely innocent. There is nothing like, well, I think it's in fact magical. How is it possible that these two substances can form this kind of interaction process where they become something more than they were independently? And the same happens when multiple neurons in our minds, all these biochemical processes, when they form this the process of consciousness. This is weakly emergent, and exactly that's why we have to conclude that the constituents are also, they are continuous with consciousness. They are proto-conscious, whatever they are. Just like wetness cannot come from something completely different than wetness, you cannot get consciousness from something completely different. And you always get the objection that by the same logic, everything is continuous with wetness. And that is correct. Everything is continuous with wetness because wetness in itself is continuous also with consciousness. You have to keep in mind this parallelism or duality between models and things in themselves. You have my consciousness here and the scientific model of it, and then you have water in itself and the scientific model of it. And so what is this water in itself? It must be, I cannot say anything except for infer from my own case.
Right. I mean, you have this great paper on, I think it's called consciousness as a concrete physical process or phenomenon. And in that you're saying that the consciousness is, you describe consciousness as physical, which on first reading, given that a lot of people define physical as the opposite of mental, it could sound like you're almost trolling people, that it's like a strange claim. But it's really, I feel like it relates to what you're saying here, in the sense that what I took away from it was the claim that, as you said earlier, that you see a kind of identity relationship, an equivalence between the thing in itself feeling like this, and from the outside, you might call it neural activity or whatever the physical description is. But all of this is the stuff that makes up reality that we study with physics. So it makes sense to use the term physics or physical to refer to consciousness. Is that a reasonable summary?
Yeah, it is. It is. Because no one would really think or conflate physics with the physical, because everybody agrees, if they are realists, and I believe most physicists are realists, they believe that atoms, molecules, whatever, they really exist out there. There is something out there. It's not mind dependent in any way, although our picture of reality is of course mind dependent. So they all agree that the physical is always out there and it's distinct from the theory. But we were talking earlier about this sense of mystery, about how deep is the gap between the theory and what it's about. So that is what distinguishes my materialism from most ordinary forms of materialism. Galen Strawson calls this kind of materialism real materialism, that is realistic about consciousness, and also understands the width or depth of the epistemic gap. And Galen Strawson infers panpsychism from these two premises, that consciousness is physical and the scientific model is not the modeled. And he also has a word for this other kind of physicalism, and he calls it physicsalism. It's the belief that, this is where it gets tricky, the belief that science captures everything about the physical, or science can tell us everything about what matter is. And I say it's tricky because, in a sense, it is true that science can tell us everything about matter. It can model every aspect of consciousness in principle, although it would be like extremely difficult. But the model is still not the modeled, and the description is not the description. So you can be an eliminativist. You can deny that there would be these qualia that constitute what experiences feel like. You can deny that there are these kinds of phenomenal properties that would be distinct from the physical properties. And I am eliminativist in this sense. I consider that there are no phenomenal properties if that means something distinct from all the physical properties. So in that sense, I would also be a physicalist according to Strawson's terminology, but this is not what he means. It's just so difficult to capture in words. It is just physicalist is the one who mistakes the map for the territory, although they never admit that they do. Maybe we do that also.
I don't know. I think, yeah, we're all, if we're using language, we're often over reifying the reality of the models. But there's a big, I think, in a video I watched of you talking about kind of fundamentalism, you were pointing out how even in Zen Buddhism, there's still language, there's still concepts, but at least there are concepts that point to skepticism around taking them too seriously. So I think that's what the antidote you need. You need a point. If you're going to use concepts, you want them to often be pointing to their own limitations, pointing to the non-conceptual. And speaking of non-conceptual experiences, I'd love to talk to you about psychedelics as well, because I understand that you kind of, as part of your work, you know, I guess given that consciousness is an experiential thing, that you were interested in exploring psychedelics as a way to look into these kind of mystical experiences.
Yeah, that's true. I recently did a psychedelic work trip that I also report publicly. And we had a journalist there with us when we did the trip, and she makes an article about that. And we had a pre-discussion about prior to the experience, and now we are going to have a post discussion. And the reason, I cannot speak for others, but for me personally, the reason to be so open about that, although it's illegal in Finland, well, it's not illegal to have psychedelic experiences, but it's illegal to use certain kinds of substances. The reason why I'm open about this is because it's so, it's a taboo. There are many people who have had these experiences, and they had profound meaning for them. They were life transforming, and they are really like something important in their lives. And this is confirmed empirically that this is in fact what is typical of psychedelic experiences, that they are considered as deeply meaningful and significant life events. And people have these experiences, but they are criminals. They cannot be open about their insights and intuitions. They must stay in the closet. I think this resembles a lot the situation with homosexuals, sexual minorities previously, and even now in many countries, that they have to hide what they are genuinely. They have to hide what they are in themselves, intrinsically, in this sense. So I think that's ethically wrong. And there are also ethical problems in being open about my own use of a psychedelic substance, because it can be considered as like suggesting that to others, like pushing them in that direction. And I don't want to do that, because I see that it can be dangerous if done in the wrong setting with wrong kind of people and without proper kind of preparation and so on. So there are ethical problems as well, but I think the ethical benefits outweigh the problems, and that's why I'm open about it. I might be mistaken. I'm open to discuss this, but the reason why I did it in the first place, not doing it publicly, but in the first place, it was Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, it changed my mind. It woke my interest, and I of course became really curious. And the interesting thing about consciousness is that you can know everything about its neuroscience and everything scientific about it, and even subjective reports, and even you can listen to psychedelic music and you can watch psychedelic movies, but still that's different from personally having that experience, because consciousness is inherently subjective. You cannot know it, what it's in itself, without undergoing it. So that's why I wanted to undergo it, and I think it was worth it, like also professionally.
So what were your intentions going into it? Were you hoping to test if it was similar to your spontaneous mystical experience?
That was one motivation, and it was quite different. Alan Watts writes in the same way that there are similarities and differences. I think it mainly amplified what I already believed. So it's really ineffable. It confirmed how ineffable it is and how impossible it is to capture in any proper terms, because it's an experience that is like open to the extreme, or like it has degrees of freedom, infinite degrees of freedom, meaning that you can like conceptualize it in infinite ways, and still each of the ways of conceptualizing are inadequate. So it brings about this, what you have in mysticism research, like Walter Stace, I think he talked about this like canceling. And we are not talking about cancel culture here. We are talking about you try to say something about it, and immediately after saying it, you must cancel what you just said. Forget about that. It was inadequate. And now you get another idea of expressing it, and then you again cancel it. So it's this iterative loop or recurrent process, recursion, where you try to capture it and lose it by trying. But then when you stop trying, then you attain it. So I think it confirmed these Zen ideas about the role of reflective consciousness in capturing what this in itself is. Can we ever know consciousness in itself without modeling it? It's a really difficult question, because whenever you think of consciousness, you are thinking of it. You are not being it. Can you just be consciousness? And then you cannot communicate it in any way. But there are like a wide range of implications that I haven't been able to report or conceptualize. Right now I'm writing a book which I was ordered by a publishing house in Finland. It will be in Finnish, but I decided it will be a non-academic book. It will be just like this essay type of like more personal text. So it's one effort to try to conceptualize some of it, but really it cannot be conceptualized. That's the main point. It's just a catalyst or raw material for this kind of performance that we call speech. And you can express it or perform it in many ways while acknowledging that it cannot ever be conceptualized.
Do you think psychedelics could be a useful tool in philosophy and science because of their ability to dissolve models and concepts? And I feel like they can show people that the map isn't the territory, and maybe push people in make people think more the way that we think.
Yes, I'm writing an article now. It's called Mary on Acid, about Frank Jackson's Mary thought experiment. Well, everybody probably knows it, but it's about this neuroscientist who has never seen colors. You can assume that she's blind or completely colorblind, and she knows everything about color vision, but does she learn something when she sees the rainbow for the first time? And you can also ask, if you have a expert neuroscientist, pharmacologist who knows everything about psychedelics and how they act on the serotonin receptors and so on, can you know what it's like to have the trip? And the point there is, in that paper, it is mainly negative again, because I think negative things are what psychedelics can teach us. And here, I'm not sure if it's negative or not. Maybe there are both components, negative and positive. The negative is exactly like you mentioned, the difference between the map and the territory, like really realizing that there is this gap. And basically, when we realize that the epistemic gap is simply difference between the model and the modeled, then we can stop philosophy, at least in neuroscience of consciousness. Then we can really just go on doing the neuroscience of consciousness and not worrying about the philosophy side of it anymore, in my opinion. But it's also a philosophical insight in itself, this sense of mystery of not knowing about reality. But that's the negative part. Is there something positive that psychedelics, the psychedelic experience can teach us? And I think there is, and it is this. To see consciousness in itself, what it is, to see that it is this here right now, it's happening now, it's all the time in front of us. So it's no point in wondering what is consciousness, because we know it all the time just through existing here. And it's impossible for me to not know it, because if I didn't know it, I would be dead, because all the time I'm or like brain dead or unconscious. Subjectively, it's the same thing for me. Not conscious, not here, not this. So I cannot even imagine what it is to not exist, because, well, it's impossible. So the positive point is just to see that consciousness is this, to see consciousness in itself. You have these recursive cycles when you try to capture what consciousness is, but when you stop trying to capture, then you get it, as in Zen philosophy, because you are it. That's the positive insight. And I think there is nothing mystical or supernatural about that, but it also explains why consciousness is ineffable, and not just psychedelic experience, but all consciousness is ineffable.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Jussi.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed it. And I've really enjoyed following you on Twitter as well, which I definitely recommend people to do. I'll put a link to your handle in the description. Is there anywhere else online you'd recommend people go to look into your work?
Well, they can go to my YouTube channel, but it's really just me talking to trees and other kinds of nonsense. But it's because my family is bored of listening to my philosophy, so I just go talk to the trees.
Yeah, I recommend it. It's a good listen. All right, and thanks again, Jussi.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cook.